Fab, thank you. Cool. So the reading today is from Matthew 6, verses 25 to 34. Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or your body, what you will wear. Is not life more than food, and body more than clothes? Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they are? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? And why do you worry about clothes? See how the flowers of the field grow. They do not labor or spin. Yet I tell you that not even Solomon in all his splendor was dressed like one of these. If that is how God clothes the grass of the field, which is here today and tomorrow is thrown into the fire, will he not much more clothe you, you of little faith? So do not worry, saying, what shall we eat? Or what shall we drink? Or what shall we wear? For the pagans run after all these things, and your heavenly Father knows you need them. But seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you as well. Therefore, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Brilliant. So I'd like to invite Amy up. Amy Fortnum. There's too many Amy's. I'm just going to pray for her before she speaks. So if we can just all stretch out a hand and just lift her up in prayer. Father, thank you for Amy. I thank you for the words that you've given her to speak, Father. Thank you for the preparation that's gone into this talk. And Lord, I just pray that you would stir our hearts to love you more and to just learn more about you and how you work in and through us, Jesus. And I pray that the words that Amy speaks, Lord, would be from you. And I thank you that you use her in this amazing way. Give her peace now. Amen.
Hello. I'm Amy. I am one of the students who comes to St Michael's, and like Hannah and Steffi, I've been coming for about a year and a half. The course I study is Politics and International Relations, so you can imagine the kind of chaos that my week involves. But today we're going to be talking about how even in chaos we can give our fears and our anxiety to God. Okay. So when we heard the verse that Steffi read out, then the phrase that was repeated several times was "do not worry." And I wonder how often you hear "do not worry." For me, it's almost on a daily basis. And I wonder how often do you find those words comforting? So much for me depends on the person who's telling me, the context that I'm in, their tone of voice, their body language. And sometimes these words can be super affirming and really helpful. But they can also sometimes be delivered in a cliche and passive way. And when we hear Bible verses that include references to flowers and birds, it is perhaps tempting to disregard them as superficial, as happy-clappy, and oh, that's a nice idea, but it's not really real, is it? We can't really take those verses seriously. And I wonder if that changes when we hear God say those verses. Do we take them any more seriously? Sometimes I can think, well, actually, God, if you knew what I was facing, then you would give me a bit more than "do not worry." That's just not good enough. And I have thrown these verses back into God's face. And today, as we unpack these verses, we're going to examine each of the options that are presented to us. I'm going to share some stories from times where I have felt anxious and afraid and what I have done in those situations. And I'm going to close with a call for justice and hope, because that's always a good idea. I wonder if you have ever received cringy advice or had a well-meaning Bible verse thrown your way when you've been struggling. How has this felt? I rarely feel empowered when I see these kind of pictures on Facebook or Instagram. I don't feel calm in these situations, even when the people who are sending them to me have the best intentions. In the verse we heard, it says, "Therefore I tell you, do not worry about your life." That's a pretty bold assertion. But perhaps we serve a pretty bold God. As we dig into these verses, we're going to look at the context of the chapter and the theme that is established is choice. Jesus is presenting 3 ways of life and advocating for integrity. But it is up to us to choose which path we're going to take. First, we hear about the hypocritical lifestyle obsessed over by the religious elite. The second choice we hear is about materialistic concerns that pagans have. And finally, we hear how God wants us to live, trusting him to provide. For the first group, Jesus reserves his harshest words for those who relish in looking down on other people. When people present themselves as experts and as superior, then we are called to respond to that and hold those people to account. And it is for these reasons that he rejects the elitist way of life. The second choice we hear about is the way of the pagans. Their worries are disregarded as shallow. And it's not that God is ignoring those for whom food and drink and clothing is a genuine daily struggle. Rather, it is a matter of our priorities and trust in God's provision for our necessities. Global inequality existed in biblical times, just as it does today, and God is not ignorant to this reality. Billionaire wealth has risen by an annual average of 13% since 2010, 6 times faster than the wages of ordinary workers, which have risen on a yearly average of just 2%. It takes 4 days for a CEO of one of the top 5 global fashion brands to earn what a Bangladeshi garment worker will earn in their lifetime. When we read in Matthew later on, in chapter 25, we hear about the duty and responsibility we have to feed the hungry, to give drink to the thirsty, to invite the stranger in, to clothe the naked, look after the sick, and visit those in prison. Those who have resources, whether that be time or food or money, are called to give generously to God's kingdom. There are 2.3 billion Christians in the world, which makes up 32% of the population. I wonder what opportunities we have to address this global inequality, to be God's hands and feet in crises. What would it look like to see the kingdom come on an individual, local, national and international level? I wonder what your reaction is when you hear the statistics like that. Is it one of shock or one of frustration? Can you feel your eyes roll as you hear numbers that speak to the reality that you're aware of? When God talks about provision of necessities, I believe it's because he's laying the foundations for us to thrive and reach our potential. When we hold on to our wealth, our resources and time, we are potentially denying others the opportunity to thrive. Last Sunday, we heard about what it means to be rich and the difference between appearing to do social justice and actually doing social justice. This is a theme that I will build on later in the talk. The final choice of the 3 that is presented to us is God's plan. We're invited to live lives free from fear and anxiety, lives of unapologetic integrity. This is something I daily strive for. And this topic confronts us in this generation, in this time, with a new sense of urgency, as we are told again and again that we are an individualistic, me-centered generation. Jesus asks us to make a choice by weighing up the different paths. We are free to choose the pagan way of life. We are free to choose the way of the religious elite. Or we can choose to live a life that is inspired by Jesus. When I think of times when I have been my most afraid and most anxious, then it doesn't take long for Cape Town memories to come up. For those of you who don't know, I spent 4 months in 2017 interning in the social justice department of the Projects Abroad human rights law firm. From photos like this, you would probably not think that I was terrified for 4 months. This is the kind of thing that I put on my Facebook and my Instagram because I couldn't take photos in prisons with gangsters. I couldn't take photos with women who I was doing workshops with on female empowerment. I couldn't take photos or selfies with people in a government care facility who were there because it was no longer safe for them to live in their communities. So for some people, this is the kind of image they saw of my trip. And that was challenging, because then when I came home and I was a bit broken, and people said, hey, wow, I saw you doing things like this. That's incredible. And I said, yeah, that is incredible. That was amazing. But it's not the whole story. It's not the whole picture. There was quite a lot going on. So in reality, the experience I got was more than I thought I'd signed up for. Instead of learning from my supervisor, building my confidence over time, perhaps shadowing more experienced people before being given serious responsibility, I was thrown into a deep end that only got deeper. On my first day, I was asked if I was good at public speaking. And I said, yeah, I'm all right. And they said, oh, okay. Could you lead a workshop on peer pressure in the most dangerous juvenile male prison the next day? I was like, ooh, okay. And being me, I was like, yep, cool, sounds like fun. And that's where my internship started. That was week 1, day 1. And for the first 2 weeks of my internship, I was the only volunteer on the project. So when they said, hey, are you good at public speaking? That meant, would you like to run this project that you've only just discovered for 2 weeks? Yeah, that'll be fine. So that was intense. And this is where the internship started, and then you can only imagine where I was at 4 months later, as they got to know me better and put more and more responsibility onto my shoulders. By the end of my internship, I was leading a team of international volunteers who were older than me into prisons on my own. I did house visits in the largest township on my own. And it was once my responsibility to formally request that a child be removed from their home because they were near death and their mother was unable to look after them. And then I was asked, whilst my supervisor went on holiday to Sweden in my last week, if I could just, plan the rest of the year's workshops so that my work could continue after I left. My to-do list has changed just a little bit since my trip in Cape Town. And as I describe this to you, you're probably thinking, that sounds a bit much. And that would be because it absolutely was. If someone had sent me a pretty picture with flowers and birds on, and a Bible verse, I would have struggled to not explode. But did that mean that I decided to throw out my Bible, not pray, or maybe just lower my expectations of what God could achieve? Or just delete prayer completely from my life, because what was the point in praying when there were such big issues that I was fighting on a daily basis? It did not. Instead, I prayed like I had never prayed before or since. I let go and I leaned in. And of course, I notebooked everything. And it was painful. In preparation for this talk, I read through some of my old blog posts from Cape Town, and I was struck by my self-awareness and determination to keep going, no matter how little success I saw. I didn't see God move mountains in the 4 months that I volunteered, but I did leave with my sanity intact, my values further entrenched, a wider appreciation for my global church family, and a life-changing friendship founded on West Wing and Hamilton. I tried to keep this quote in mind. This is from one of my favorite poets, Andrea Gibson. And she says, "It's totally fine if I blow off steam, as long as I speak in an octave my kindness can still reach." As you can imagine, there were plenty of times where I would come home from work and rant and call up family or friends and say, "You will not believe what I was asked you to do today." Like, I witnessed an armed robbery. There was a time when I couldn't go into a prison because the girls there had set their beds on fire. There were times when I would arrive at the prison, and instead of being searched once, I was searched 4 times because they'd had a recent scare with people bringing in drugs and weapons into the prison. So there were times when I felt like exploding. I wonder if you think about the times when you have felt anxious or fearful or angry at God. Did you see God move mountains in those situations? Did you perhaps come out of those situations with little more than your sanity intact? Perhaps with glimmers of hope rather than rays of sunshine? In these times, we don't have to choose between deleting God from our life or insincere, happy clappy praise. We can choose to acknowledge God walking with us. Psalm 23 says this, "Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and staff, they comfort me." When I hear this verse, I am reminded that we can always hurl our anger, our worries, our exhaustion onto him, because he will always, always be big enough to handle our rawest emotions and deepest despair. When we examine the verses in Matthew 6, we see some clear concerns addressed about the necessities of clothes and food and drink. But I wonder if God is promising us a little bit more than material provision. What if he is in fact offering us the tools to survive and the opportunity to have a relationship that would allow us to thrive? I remember in Sunday school, someone telling me that the letters in the word Bible stood for best instructions before leaving Earth. I wonder how we're doing at reading those instructions before we take leaps into the dark. Like me, do you need a reminder that we are living in a universe created by a creator who knew what they were doing? Would we indeed be able to worry one day at a time if we grounded ourselves in God's promises a little more and took them as gospel truth rather than merely nice quotes from a time gone by? When I was in Cape Town, I depended on the church for consistent support that could come from nowhere else. Just walking into a place of worship allowed me to feel at peace. When so much was unknown and constantly changing, going to church was a common language that I could just fall into. And I got given the most astounding opportunities by being in the right church at the right time. During my 14 weeks, I visited 9 different churches and was made incredibly welcome, even if I was only there for a week and didn't go back. I was invited to go on the world's biggest prayer walk through a prison. And most prison prayer walks, I don't know if you guys know, happen kind of around the outskirts of a prison. So you're not allowed in to the cells because that's considered dangerous. Cape Town, throw that out the way. Who needs health and safety? In you go. I was told to bring my passport with me. They didn't even open the passport. And just it was enough that I was holding a document that looked like a document. In you go. So in I went, and I was with 300 other Christians, which is already pretty incredible. And then we're in this room that's got some Bible verses and some art, and then people just start some impromptu worship as we wait, because obviously nothing runs to time, there isn't a plan. So we just chill, and then people start singing these songs that sound like kids' worship songs. So very repetitive, and even though at times they're in a new language, then I started to pick them up. And so we did that for a bit. And then on the first time I went to the female unit. And we then go through the doors, and like a snake working round, the group splits into 2. So we're then in teams of 150. So still quite the crowd. You then walk past the cells, so you see the women. And in different parts of the prison, there is different amounts of security. So at times, we would see the women in front of the bars, as you imagine, but we could see their whole face, and they would reach their hands out through the bars and were just beaming. And I was so taken aback. I was expecting people who were apathetic, who were stressed or nervous or just not that bothered. And I was completely taken aback because they were thrilled that we were there. People were singing, people were having Bible verses, and people were praying. People who go every month knew some of the women and would go and check in with them, chat to them. And then there were other parts of the prison where there was a ward where there was a whole group of people. And then people would be pushing and shoving to try and see what was happening and what was going on. And then there were other parts of the prison where it was like a wall, and then a little window was barred. And then you would only be able to see hands because you couldn't see their faces. But what I was struck by was their absolute joy. what an incredible life experience to have. The following day, just casually, I went to a different church that I'd been to that Sunday, and they said, we're doing a talk on Prison Alpha. And I thought, that sounds quite interesting, quite relevant to what I'm doing. Turn up, meet the Global Development Manager of Prison Alpha, and just say, hey, I was on this prayer walk yesterday, and he was also there. And we talked about that experience, and it was him who told me that it is the biggest prayer walk in the world, because his job is to travel around different countries and teach Alpha to the chaplains in lots of different prisons. And so he knows what he's doing when he talks about prison prayer walks. So that was pretty cool. And I had these kind of experiences week on week, and it really showed me that God was present in the details. I gave every day all that I had, and I was hyper aware that this would sometimes be met with indifference from staff members, ignorance from government officials, and unhealthy dependence from fellow volunteers. But I did it because I had surrendered the outcomes to God. Hard work, organisation, and creativity wasn't enough to move the mountains of institutional oppression. The reoffending rate in Cape Town is 90%. I'll just give you a second for that to sink in. 90%. And I am not naive enough to believe that those workshops that I did on human rights and refugees and drugs and alcohol were enough, no matter how enthusiastically they were given, to convince people that maybe the life of gangsterism just wasn't for them. And as I walked around the maximum security prison on my second visit, I went to the male unit, and this time we weren't allowed to walk through the corridors. Instead, we were in a courtyard with the cells round the outside. We were in a square. And so we just kind of walked around praying for a while. And that was a completely different experience. There, I felt desperation leak out of the walls, and I felt hopelessness, and I saw the overcrowding. In that prison, the staff to prisoner ratio was 1 to 100. That is the kind of situation we're talking about. So you can imagine that throughout my weeks, I felt like I was perhaps in a bit of a Gideon situation. We read in Judges 6 that Gideon says, "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." I worked for an understaffed office that could have done with 300,000 volunteers, let alone 300. Instead, for 4 months in 2017, they got me. And I came into work every day with an 8-year mental health history, no law or teaching qualifications, and I'm sure there were better people in the world that could have run the Social Justice Department for the Project Abroad human rights law firm. And there were times when I was at work, and many times since, that I have asked God, why me and why them? Why me? Who am I to be called a mighty warrior? Why them? Where were you in my client's crumbling circumstances? Are they not worth more than the birds in the sky? How do they respond when they hear Bible verses like this one, telling them not to worry, it's okay? And I brought all of these thoughts and more to God. And I chose to walk down the path that he had presented me and to trust him with the eternal consequences. A few weeks ago, one of my friends asked if I'd seen the news about Amnesty. And I scanned the headlines, and I found nothing. And I searched online, and I found a Guardian article discussing the findings of an independent report into the toxic culture at head office. It spoke of a state of emergency that many staff felt they were daily operating in. It spoke of bullying and racism, of sexism and significant stress that no less than 70% of the HQ staff felt. Reading the details caused me to despair. Whilst the editors of BBC News didn't see this as breaking, it certainly felt like that for me. It spoke of the dangers of martyrdom culture, which is a reality that I reluctantly identify with. I have long aspired to work for Amnesty International, and I had hoped that they would value people better than the Projects Abroad human rights law firm that I worked in during my gap year. And whilst I am not naive enough to believe that they would meet my grand expectations of dignity and respect for the universality of human rights without fault, I did expect civility, I did expect kindness, and I did expect a sense of team. To see that right now, that isn't the day-to-day reality for Amnesty staff was tough. And I brought this new fear to God. And I was reminded that to worry about my future would not add a single hour to my life. I refuse to let the world lower my expectations of love. We see love presented radically in every book of the Bible. And Jesus gives us a choice for what lifestyle we want to lead. We can choose the way of the religious hypocrites, or the pagans, or as people of faith. It may be easier to give up on humanity, but this is a decision I will not make. I choose to expect human beings to surprise themselves with their capability for greatness. I expect God to move mountains when we fall into step with his will. And I expect to worry one day at a time, as God intended. I share these cyclical stories, and I share my passion, and I reveal my vulnerability to you. And I choose to wear my heart on my sleeve, to give grounding to the high ideals I spend a lot of my life talking about. And I hope that by listening to my stories, whilst they might not exactly mirror your own, are in some way relatable. And I hope that as we've unpacked this passage, you have gained something. And I pray that as you go into this week and you think about the call to live generously, to give up your resources so that other people have a shot at quality, to live justly and with profound integrity, that you would remember this clip that we're about to listen to, and that you would hold on to these truths that God gives us. This clip is called, Is It Even Worth It?
A lot of people see justice as the most futile thing you can do with your life. Give your life completely to business and you see the money piling up. Be a health nut, eat right, go to the gym, and your muscles will grow and your body will look good and you'll see results. But when it comes to justice, it seems like you just can't get ahead. You patch up one hole and something else rips open. You bring peace to one region and war breaks out in another. You rebuild after an earthquake and a tsunami hits. And you work and you work and you work and there's never any profit. There's no bank where you can store a surplus amount of justice in. Stability is never permanent. Something always tips and people always ask, is it even worth it? And that question, though understandable, quite frankly, it's ridiculous. And it rarely comes from those who are actually tired from pursuing justice and not just tired of the idea. It rarely comes from people who've labored for years and have good reason to ask it. And you know why they never ask? Those type of people become friends with those who suffer. Family even. Because it's one thing to wonder if someone else's freedom is worth fighting for. But when you begin to identify with that someone else, commune with them, that's when the question is no longer worth asking. That's when it becomes offensive even. What do you mean, is it worth my time? That doesn't even deserve an answer. I don't care how long it takes. I don't care how many times we fail. I don't care how little progress is made. You never stop fighting for your own.
So that is a clip that I know almost word for word because I have listened to it so many times. I hope that you found it powerful. It reminds me of the verses we hear in Ephesians. So we read in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 11. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against spiritual forces of evil in heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the armor of God, so that when the evil day comes, you may be able to stand your ground, and after everything, to stand. Stand firm with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted firmly with readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to this, take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all the flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. As we draw to a close, then I think it will be helpful to take a moment to reflect on the themes that we've identified as being integral or interlinked to Matthew 6. Anxiety and fear. Courage to live differently from both the world that is materialistic or the way of the life of the religious elites. And the call to live generously with profound integrity in response to the injustice and global inequality we see around us. Hopefully, we're now going to listen to a song that is by the Drakensberg Boys Choir. On my first trip to South Africa, I was lucky enough to see these guys in concert, and this song still encourages me and empowers me today. So as we listen to the lyrics, I hope that you would bring those themes and those thoughts to God. And then when it's finished, we're going to go into a time of worship.